Welcome, everybody. I'm Susan Lawrence from the Faith Development Office of the UUA, and I'm here with Reverend Dr. Monica L. Cummings, who is our presenter on non-suicidal self-injury this evening. A couple of housekeeping things. I'll let Monica introduce herself, and then I'll explain a little bit about the logistics.
Thank you, Susan. Hi, family. I hope everyone is well. I am the Reverend Dr. Monica L. Cummings, and I work in the Faith Development Office at the UUA. And I'll hand it back over to Susan so she can do some logistics.
Okie doke. Well, a few things. One is we don't have your mics on, so you can't be heard. We also can't see you. The only way we can know what you're thinking or who you are is on the chat screen, and you can type in any questions or comments during the entire presentation, and periodically Monica's going to ask me who's got something to say or has a question, and I'll be able to relay what your thoughts are, and we'll have a conversation that way. And it's a little awkward, but hopefully will work for everybody who is with us tonight. And I also need to let you know that the PowerPoint for this presentation is going to be available online along with a recording of tonight's webinar. And I have, if I have your contact information, you will get a notice when those things are available with the links. If I don't have your information, I'm slawrence@uua.org, and however way you found out about the webinar, hopefully there's an email contact there that you can send me a note. It'll also be posted various places. Monica has a blog, and it will be announced there as well. And on the UUA website, you'll be able to find it with a quick search. Finally, if you had the email this morning that described in detail how we were going to do this webinar, you also have some evaluation questions there. And if it's possible, if you've got time, we'd really appreciate some feedback at the end of the webinar about how this experience was for you and how useful it was and what we might do to improve or give you even more that you need. So with that, I give you Monica.
All right. Thank you, Susan. We have 3 objectives for our webinar tonight. And before I talk about the objectives, I want to give you a little background on how this webinar came to be. I was having lunch with a friend while I was on vacation, and my friend happens to be a director of religious education. And when I asked her how things were going with her youth group, she told me that she had some youth in her group who were cutting. And we talked a little more about it. And as we talked, I had a few ideas racing around in my head. And one of them was I could possibly do a webinar on the subject. So at the July Youth Advisory Ministry Committee, I asked the committee. I told the committee about the conversation I had with the DRE, and I asked for their input, and the young folks on the committee said, you know, cutting is a huge thing in youth community, and any materials we can get out and any support we can give will be really helpful. And so here we are. This is the second of 2 webinars on this subject, and as Susan said, the materials will be up on uua.org, and they'll also be on my blog. So our objectives for this webinar are to learn the difference between a suicide attempt and non-suicidal self-injury. We'll learn the symptoms and warning signs of non-suicidal self-injury. And you'll also learn what you can do to help and support young people who may be engaging in this behavior. I am going to read the information that's on the screen because there are people with us who are on the phone and therefore cannot see the slides on the screen. So bear with me for those of you who are on the computer, and just bear with me as I read the information so the folks who are on the phone will get as much information as those of you who are on computer. So when we talk about the difference between a suicide attempt or non-suicidal self-injury, intent matters. And intent matters because if someone is attempting suicide, their intent is to die. Whereas if a young person or young adult is engaging in non-suicidal self-injury, Their intent is to relieve overwhelming emotional pain in an attempt to regulate their mood. In other words, a young person engaging in NSI is trying to self-regulate, and is basically trying to feel better. And so that's the major difference between someone who's attempting suicide and someone who's engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. So who engages in this behavior? Well, up until recently, the age range started about age 14. However, recently, middle schoolers have also started to engage in NSI. And young folks as young as 11 and 12 years old are now engaging in this behavior. The end stage seems to be staying pretty stagnant. The end stage is between the ages of 28 and 30. And so my first question for you, because I really do want this to be as interactive as possible, is do you think gender matters in terms of who engages in non-suicidal self-injury and how the behavior manifests according to gender? So does gender matter? And remember, you can write your feedback in the meeting chat area.
We have some comments, Monica. Someone says, I guess it's equal among genders, and another person is only aware of girls who engage in it. Okay. And some say no, some say yes. We have about half and half both, / doesn't matter, and half probably only girls, or people only aware of girls. Yeah.
Okay. And in part in the binary gender references, all the information I've read, I didn't see anything that referenced folks who are transgender engaging in this behavior. And so folks are right that it's equally balanced between male identified and female identified, or girls and boys who engage in the behavior. However, the way it manifests between the binary genders is different. Girls are more likely to cut and burn themselves, and boys are more likely to hit themselves and to also burn themselves. So the way it shows up in the binary gender and in the way it plays out, there are differences in the way girls and boys engage in non-suicidal self-injury. So I have another question for you. Why? Why do young people engage in this behavior? What are some of the reasons you think young people, or even from your experience, that they engage in non-suicidal self-injury?
Monica, while people are answering that question, there was a clarification question a minute ago about some of the behaviors. When you're discussing which gender, are we encompassing behaviors such as cutting, reckless driving? How broad?
Yeah.
I think you're getting to that a little bit later on.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what was the question, though?
The question was what are you defining as NSI when you're asking about genders and which behaviors fit in?
Oh, in terms of how it manifests in the different genders. Boy, male identified typically are more, I guess, physical would be the best way. So they're more likely to hit themselves and to engage in reckless behavior.
So reckless driving would be.
Reckless driving could fall into that category. Whereas girls do more of the cutting, and some burning, and rubber band wrist snapping. And we will get into symptoms and risk behaviors and warning signs later on in the webinar. Does that answer your question?
Well, while she's catching up with that, oh, I've got a yes. That's
Okay,
good.
cool.
Okay,
Okay.
so some people have answered your question about why, and one person has said overwhelming emotions.
Hmm.
Um, Someone else has said your opening statements about relieving overwhelming emotions rang true with what I've seen. There is some control in being able to act and to take control of the hurt.
Hmm.
Someone has said release, relieving stress, overwhelming feelings, or circumstances for causes, overwhelming anxiety.
Yeah, you are so right. And young people engage in the behavior for temporary relief. It's similar to young people who engage in addiction. They're looking for something just to take the pressure off and to provide temporary relief for whatever emotional turmoil they're going through, to relieve tension, to self-soothe. Um, some of the research talks about attachment theory and some young people who don't have a good attachment and never learned how to self-soothe. This is a way for them to self-soothe and to regulate their mood. So everyone who gave feedback was spot on in terms of why young people engage in this behavior.
I'm going to tell you what's on the board here. One person has added there may be people who aren't sure how to get help. And another person has suggested that this is counterintuitive behavior. How could harming yourself create relief or soothe?
Yeah, and it is for young people who are in intense emotional pain. One way to relieve that intense emotional pain is to have physical pain. And it does seem counterintuitive. But if they cut themselves or hit themselves or do something to feel physical pain, it does relieve the emotional pain, or at least temporarily, it takes their mind off of the emotional pain they're in. Um, for young people who are emotionally numb, and I'll get into talking about trauma, like trauma events that cause some young people to just to numb off and they don't feel anything emotionally, they engage in non-suicidal self-injury so they can feel something, even feeling physical pain. They talk about at least I'm feeling something instead of just feeling absolutely numb. So yes, it does seem counterintuitive to engage in self-harm in order to feel better. And some people, have mentioned, is this a cry for help? And sometimes it is a cry for help. So some people will cut an arm and wear a short sleeve shirt. Cutting parties have now become something that young people do to engage in. It's primarily girls, groups of girls who get together to cut in each other's presence. And some students like to hang out with cutters. And it has given rise to the term pseudo cutters. And pseudo cutters are people who cut not to gain release, but to belong to a social group. So it's young people trying to fit in, young people trying to find just trying to find connections or engaging in this behavior. And so when you start working with your young people, your youth group, and so forth, um, you have to differentiate between those who are doing it to fit in. You have to separate out those pseudo cutters from the young people who are in intense emotional pain and are cutting to relieve that in an attempt to relieve that pain. Are there any questions about this slide?
Not yet.
Okay. So what are some of the risk factors? Who's at risk for engaging in non-suicidal self-injury? People who have psychiatric disorders, including bipolar disorder, folks who have an eating disorder, bulimia, neurosa, for example, um, young people who are struggling with anxiety and or depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and as I just mentioned, the young person has a history of traumatic life events or event. Um, all of the above are at risk for engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. And non-suicidal self-injury is a high-risk behavior. It is a high-risk behavior. It's right up there with addiction, with young people who abuse alcohol and other drugs. Just as addiction is engaging in addictive behavior is a high-risk behavior, people who engage in NSI are at a higher risk for suicide. And according to Patrick L. Kerr, people who engage in NSI are at risk for suicide report being repulsed by life, attracted to death, not afraid of death, are highly self-critical, and have tenuous family connections. And so this is something to be concerned about, because when a young person engages in non-suicidal self-injury, that puts them at a higher risk for suicide. Are there any questions?
We had a question about prevalence, and I've written to the questioner that we don't have statistics, but that things are on the rise, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
If you know where someone could find statistics like that, are some of the resources?
We'll have a list of we'll have a list of resources at the end of the presentation, and you can go online and research and look at stats. Anecdotal, each time I mention to a friend who has children and teenagers, and if the young person was present, and I mentioned I was doing this webinar, each time the young person, and they were both middle schoolers, said, yeah, they had friends who are engaging in self-injury. They have friends who are cutting. And Susan, you can comment on that if you want.
Actually, there's a couple more questions related to this slide here. One is, how does one know if the non-suicidal behavior might turn to suicidal self-injury?
Well, again, it's intent, and let me get to the next slide that talks about symptoms. All right, so, and then warning signs. So I'll answer your question when we get to warning signs. So bear with me. So what are some of the symptoms of non-suicidal self-injury? Self-punching or scratching, needle sticking, head banging, eye pressing, finger or arm biting, pulling out one's hair, picking at one's skin. And for those of you who are on the phone, I have 3 pictures on the screen, and one is of a young person with burns on their arms. Another picture is arms that have scars, cutting scars on them, and another picture is a person with a rubber band about to snap the rubber band on their wrist. And so when you start looking at the symptoms, these are some of the things that you need to be looking for. And here are the warning signs for this behavior. And again, for the folks who are on the phone, I'm going to go ahead and read what's on the screen. And so warning signs, clothing. If you have a young person who is wearing long pants and long sleeves in warm weather, that should cause you concern. You know, so it's 80-degree weather, it's really warm, and you've got a young person who's totally overdressed. And they could have on long sleeves and long pants because possibly they could be hiding scars. Odd objects. If you see a young person with a lighter and you know they don't smoke, that should cause you to be concerned. You have a young person who carries razors or other sharp objects. You know, basically, if you see a young person with objects that you don't think they ought to have, and it kind of causes you to question, you know, exactly why do they have those objects, then that could possibly be a warning sign for you to be concerned. If a young person has difficulty handling their feelings, if they're having relationship difficulties, either with someone they're dating or with family, or if they're have poor functioning at work, school, or home. And the challenging thing is you look at these warning signs, with the exception of the clothing and objects, the low self-esteem, difficulty handling feelings, relationship problems, and poor functioning at work, school, or home. It's hard to tell what could possibly be non-suicidal self-injury compared to just a typical developmental stage for a young person. And it's similar with addiction. When I do workshops and so forth on addiction and the signs of addiction, sometimes it's really hard to tell if a young person is engaging in either non-suicidal self-injury or addiction, because some of the warning signs are could possibly be just the developmental stage that they're going through, just typical adolescent behavior. So it's important to not only look at the warning signs, but to look at some of the symptoms and so forth, to kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together to find out if your young person is in trouble or not. Are there any questions?
Julie's talking about the behavior of snapping having been recommended to a 9-year-old to relieve anxiety. And that raises the question, how can you tell if something's being used as a positive coping mechanism or for stress, or whether that is something that is maybe gone too far or isn't maybe doing the right function that it was supposed to be for?
Yeah, and it's about asking a young person what is their intent. So you'd have to find out what the intent is and engaging in the behavior. And if that's a way a young person is learning to cope, then when I get to the slide that is geared toward the ministry team, helping young people find other ways to cope with whatever is going on with them internally.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
Not at this time. There was a question about alcohol and drugs and addiction, and I think you're going to get more into that in a little bit, right?
I don't
How
know.
related addiction? Actually, let me scroll back. What about alcohol, drug abuse combined with NSI?
Treatment centers, drug and alcohol treatment centers, do notice that some young people, once they're sober, will then engage in non-suicidal self-injury, almost like an addiction. And for some people, this does become an addiction. Anything that makes someone feel better can be addictive. And so, yes, young people who engage in non-suicidal self-injury, it possibly could become an addiction for them. And certainly young people who get sober from drugs and alcohol sometimes do turn to non-suicidal self-injury as a way to feel better and to take the edge off, since they no longer have the use of drugs and alcohol to do that for them. Does that make sense?
Maybe. I have a couple more questions while we wait for our yes. All right, someone's asking, so pulling hair and picking skin, not necessarily intentional, where cutting is pretty clearly intentional. How can you distinguish?
Again, I'll get to the ministry team. So the first thing to do is don't freak out. If you walk in on a young person engaging in this behavior, or you see the scars after they've engaged in the behavior, don't freak out. And you need to have a non-judgmental attitude. If a young person is engaging in this behavior, chances are they're already having feelings of shame and embarrassment. And so you being judgmental is not going to be welcoming to them and encourage them to come to you for help. So first of all, don't freak out and have a non-judgmental attitude. The ministry team needs to get together and strategize and brainstorm and look at what options they have to help the young person. Talking with the youth is extremely important. So this will answer some of the questions that have come up with the rubber band snapping and so forth. Someone needs to speak with the young person to find out what their intent is. Whoever has a good relationship with the young person, if it's the minister and the religious educator or the DRE and a favorite RE teacher, the young person, someone needs to talk with them and find out what is the intent. Is the intent suicide or is the intent non-suicidal self-injury? That's extremely important. The second thing that needs to happen after you speak with the youth to find out what their intent is, someone needs to speak with their parents, unless the parents are part of the reason that they're engaging in this behavior. If the young person is being abused at home, then of course you're not going to talk with the parents about what's going on, because the youth may be in more danger. All the information that I've read and the folks that I've spoke with have highly recommended that professional help be made available. And so you talk with the young person, you talk with the parents, and you let them know that professional help is most likely needed. I recognize that not every culture and financially not everyone will be able to go see a therapist or a psychotherapist to get help. And so it may mean that the minister and the DRE are the ones who are going to have to provide support and pastor care to the family if the family is unable to go get professional help. If that's the case, if the family is unable or unwilling to get professional help, then it is going to be up to the ministry team to provide that support. One of the things that's recommended is that that a contract be created with the young person and the family, if possible, that simply states as long as the young person is engaged in a church-related activity or event, that they will not engage in non-suicidal self-injury. And that's different from a suicide contract, where you're contracting with someone that that is encouraging them not to attempt suicide. I'm not talking about that. Suicide is a totally different thing. I'm specifically talking about a contract or a covenant with a young person that states, I will not engage in this behavior as long as I'm at a church related event. Basically, it's about harm reduction. If the family and the young person is unable or unwilling to get professional help, then it's about harm reduction. Some of the resources that are available is check in your area and see if you can have someone come in and speak to your youth group about coping skills. Help them look at how they can self-soothe in healthy ways. You can sit down with your youth group and you can have a youth group meeting that is focused on, answering the question when you're emotionally, feeling emotionally intense, when you're at the end of your patience or so forth. What do you do? What healthy ways do you have to cope? And so what you can do as a ministry team is start giving young people coping skills, start giving them some skills that they can use to help themselves self-soothe. When they do feel emotionally overwhelmed, they have other options besides engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. Does that answer people's questions?
While we wait for new questions, there's been a question about distinguishing between the fake cutters and the I'm looking for the question. The the cutting, the social cutters, I guess, versus the ones who are really serious about hurting themselves.
Well, one way is young people engage in non-suicidal self-injury really are trying to keep this private and secret. So they're not the ones who are going to, for lack of a better word, flaunt their scars or flaunt their injuries. The pseudo-cutters are the ones who will cut and wear short sleeves. Now, I'm not saying that if someone engaged in non-suicidal self-injury, if they're really crying out for help, of course, they're going to let their scars be seen in the hope that whoever sees the scars will help them. But again, it's about talking with the young person and finding out what their intent is. That's really the only way to find out what is going on with the young person, is to sit them down and ask them. And I'll get to some of the questions that you can ask them to kind of weed out those who are pseudo cutters as opposed to those who are engaging in behavior to relieve tension and to relieve the overwhelming emotional pain that they're in. So here are some questions that you can ask. Do you repeatedly injure yourself in some way? Do you often think about hurting yourself? Do you spend time planning ways of hurting yourself? Do you touch or look at the scars afterward? Do you feel increased tension or anxiety before hurting yourself? Do you feel pleasure or release during or afterward? So these questions, beside, are one way that you can start getting a clear picture if the young person is a pseudo cutter or if they're engaged in the behavior because they're in pain. Does that help?
Thank you, very helpful.
Okay. And these are additional questions that can be asked.
Not yet. Oh, those questions. I'm sorry. I'm looking for our questions.
What effect is this having on your life? It seems like self-injury serves a function for you. Are there any disadvantages to continuing to do this to yourself? Is there anything that's motivating you to stop self-injuring right now? And so the questions on both slides are ways for you to engage the young person, because people will ask, well, how do you even begin to ask a young person about the behavior? Again, you sit down with them. If you have a safe congregations policy where an adult can't be alone with the young person, like I said, if it's the minister, if it's a religious education teacher, or the DRE, here are some questions that you can use to start off. Simply saying, I attended this webinar. I've noticed scars, burns, or I've noticed you have that rubber band, and I noticed that periodically you snap the rubber band on your wrist. And so I need to ask you a few questions because I'm concerned. I'm concerned that you may be engaged in this behavior. And when you talk with the young person, don't use non-suicidal self-injury, because they probably will not know what you're talking about. Be specific. If you see scars that look like cutting, then you use the phrase cutting. If you see burns, you use the phrase burns. Because again, most young people will not know what non-suicidal self-injury is or what that means. Does that make sense?
We have a yes.
Okay. And here are more questions. It sounds like it's difficult to handle the stress in your life without self-injuring. How would your life be different right now if you were not self-injuring? And there are a lot of options for getting help for this problem. What do you think you would need to get help to stop self-injuring? So here are questions that you can ask the young person to not only get them to start reflecting on what they're doing, but also it'll just give you more tools to work with as you try to sort through and figure out who's a pseudo cutter as opposed to a young person who really, really, really needs help and support. Any questions?
We have some comments that our questions are helpful.
Okay. And on the screen are resources, 4 websites and 1 book. The last resource is a book. And for the person who wanted to know about statistics, either the WebMD or the Mayo Clinic websites, I think, will give you some stats.
I'm going to put those up in the chat in a second.
Okay. And while you do that,
let's see, we've got a couple of questions here for you. You ready?
yes.
Okay. These questions assume that the youth wants to stop cutting. What if it's a survival tactic for them?
Exactly. And that's why it's recommended that they get professional help, especially for young people who have had traumatic events such as sexual abuse or physical abuse. Indeed, it is a survival technique. It is something that they do to regulate mood and to self-soothe as a way to just cope with the overwhelming emotional pain that they're in. And so that's why it is highly recommended that the young person get professional help so they can start working on recovering from the traumatic event, and also they can work on other ways to cope with the pain and other ways to self-soothe that aren't harmful. Because although a young person's intent may not to be to attempt suicide, there have been occasions where a young person who was cutting bled out. They horribly misjudged how they were cutting and bled to death. And so that's why it's important to find out intent, and that's why it's really important to get them professional help. To recommend that in the event that the parents or the young person are, like I said, unwilling or unable to get professional help, then it's the ministry team that's going to be responsible for working with the family, providing the pastoral care, and also supporting them and helping them find healthier ways to cope with stress. And I would recommend to all of you, youth advisors, religious educators, ministers, I think it's highly valuable for you to teach young people coping skills, to teach young people how to regulate mood, to teach young people skills that they can use when they're feeling stressed out or feeling overwhelmed. Help them to start sorting through those feelings and those emotions, and help them find healthy ways to deal with it, other than turning to drugs, other than turning to alcohol, other than turning to sex or non-suicidal self-injury.
A couple more questions. This one's similar to the question you just addressed. Do most youth doing NSI see it as a problem or serious enough to make a change?
The young people that I've spoken with didn't necessarily see it as a problem. They saw it as a way to deal with what was going on inside of them. So to have the awareness that this is a problem, I again equate it with addiction, drugs, and alcohol. It's something that's helping temporarily to relieve pain.
So the youth are not so preoccupied with their symptoms; they're involved with the cause. That's what you're saying.
Well, it's pretty much in. And again, we're talking about young people whose brains aren't fully developed, who really don't have the skills to process like adults do, to problem solve, to access other ways to deal with when they're in emotional distress.
Next question is there any crossover, maybe especially for males, between this behavior and the sort of, quote, jackass-inspired reckless behavior, fight club sort of stuff between male friends?
That's a good question, and I don't know. I don't know if the outrageous stunts and Fight Club and so forth, I don't know if there's any correlation or relationship between that behavior and non-suicidal self-injury. Subconsciously, maybe, I don't know, but nothing that I read or folks that I spoke with did that come up.
We have a couple of questions about denial, and I'll read these two to you. What's the next line of action if you approach someone engaged in this activity and they deny it? And the next person has asked, do you go ahead and tell a parent if you have spoken with a young person about your concerns and they clearly deny trying to hurt themselves?
Yes, you talk with the parents and you do it in a non-threatening, non-accusatory manner. You talk with the parents, you can say you attended this webinar, you've seen the scars, and you're concerned. The same way that you would approach your parent if you smelled weed on marijuana, if you sense that you smelled marijuana on a young person, they denied it, or you smelled alcohol in their breath and they denied it. It's similar. You would engage the parents and not to alarm them. So you would approach them in a way, like I said, that wasn't accusing the young person, but you couch it in concern. You have this information, you have this new knowledge, and you see scars or you see behavior that looks out of place, like they have a razor with them and scars. Absolutely, you talk with the parents. If you're a religious educator, you talk with the minister, and as a ministry team, you figure out how to approach the parents, again, in a way that's not accusing the young person, but letting the parents know that you're concerned.
I'm going to skip to this question. Can you offer suggestions for providing guidance to those young people who are trying to be friends of those kids who are self-harming?
You can ask the questions, some of the questions, to find out what's going on with them, like why are they engaging in that behavior? Are they isolated? Are they, why are they choosing to be part of a social scene that involves non-suicidal self-injury? And so again, talking with the young person, and relationship is really important. I don't have to say the better the relationship you have with young people, the more they will be willing to talk with you about this stuff, and the more comfortable I think you'll be approaching them about it. So to separate the pseudo cutters from the folks who are engaging in the behavior, again, you can ask them some of the questions, like, how is this behavior adding to your life? What is it that is missing in your life that you're engaging in this behavior? And again, it's giving them tools, helping them to really think about and analyze and reflect on what they're doing.
That goes to our next question, which is the strategy to give the person alternative ways for dealing with their problems, or is there more to it?
Well, if if they're able to get into counseling, seeking professional help, then the role of the church would be to provide them support and to have have church be a safe container for them to be in. If they're not willing to get professional help and it's up to the ministry team, then yes, part of the support would be to give them some coping skills. Part of the support would be to help them to start reflecting on what they're doing and why they're doing it. Again, it's having a youth group session be focused on when you feel stressed out, what are some healthy things you do? It's making sure the young person has adults who they can talk with about what's going on in their life. There's a reason if the young person is engaged in non-suicidal self-injury, there's a reason they're doing it. And they need help. And anything you do that helps them cope with and learn how to cope with what's going on with them will be to their benefit. Does that answer the question?
I have a rephrase of the previous question in the meantime. About peer support, the friends who are actually trying to be friends and not the social followers, but the ones who would like to support their peers. Is there some way to talk to them?
Again, if the more young people who are trained as chaplains, the better, because then they're given skills to support young people. Small group ministry, if few churches in your area, if your youth group isn't large enough to have a small group ministry for youth, then try to combine and see if you can form. And that might be helpful. Commit to Community would be a wonderful format because it'll allow young people to talk about, what are the struggles that they're having in their life, or what are the concerns that they have about people in their life who they love who are struggling with something. And so you can find the Commit to Community format and information on the UUA.org under workshops for youth, and you can also find the information on my blog, and it's UU Living Mosaic. And I think Susan may be putting those links. And so small group ministry where young people are, the format can be, like most small group ministry or covenant groups where there's a focused question. And the focused question could be, again, when you're under emotional stress, what do you do? What healthy ways do you have to cope? Does that answer the question?
Okay. We've got a couple of things to contribute here. One person is suggesting another resource that we did not have on our list, which is To Write Love on Her Arms. I don't know if that's a book. Maybe it might be online. To Write Love on Her Arms provides a safe online and in-person community for youth to talk about these issues.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Oh, it's a nonprofit organization. Is that, Sue, can you type in if you know whether they have a website and what the name of it might be? And meanwhile, I'm putting up, here comes the link for that. I think I've got to retype it for everyone to see it. Okay, here's Rev Monica's blog is coming up.
And I will also make a animated video on this based on this on the webinar material, and that'll probably take me a couple of weeks to get out, but that'll be another resource for you to use with your youth group and parents and ministry team.
Okay, here comes the other link. Okay,
Thank you, Susan.
sure. The other resources should have appeared a little while ago, the other links. Someone has asked about alternative approaches and whether some of the resources that we've provided have some ideas for alternative strategies. And that was back with the question about, is there more than trying to get them to deal with their other problems that can be done?
Okay, I don't think I fully understand the question.
Okay, the first question was, is the strategy to give the person alternative ways for dealing with their problems, or is there more to it?
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about professional help, and then the same person's asking if we have some resources that can move us along to ideas for alternative strategies or a broader approach.
A broader approach.
Alternative strategies. I guess if you can write us a little more about what you're asking, that would be helpful. And okay. Okay. I'm looking for a list of alternative ways for dealing with problems other than NSI.
My blog is a great resource. If you go to my blog and the link is up there under Pastoral Care, I have a number of videos. Actually, I'd recommend that you look in each section, because each section has videos that deals with different issues, from identity development, ethnic, racial, gender, sexual orientation, addiction. And like I said, in a couple of weeks, there'll be an additional video that will cover this material. And whoever asked that question, feel free to contact me offline, so you can be more specific with what it is you're looking for, and perhaps I can give you more information.
Here's another question. Can you talk more about healthy? Can you talk? I think what we're saying is, can you talk more about healthy self-soothing for youth in emotional pain?
Well, so I'll bounce the question back to you. What do you do when you're in emotional pain? What do you do when you're stressed out? What are some of the things you do when you're stressed out? I know some of the things I do when I'm stressed out is I exercise. So exercising is a way that I cope, whether it's going for a walk or cycling or using my NordiTrack. Another way I self-soothe and relax, I sit in my hot tub as a way to relax and self-soothe. I talk to trusted friends as a way to regulate my mood and to feel support and not alone. And so, what are some of the ways you self-soothe? What are some of the things you do when you're feeling out of sorts or emotionally stressed? What are some of the things you do?
I'm waiting. Someone says, a different person says, read something trashy, or maybe it's just escapist.
Yes. Playing computer games. That's another thing.
Meditate.
Meditate. Prayer. Listen to music.
Walk in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Art. Sing.
Indeed.
These are wonderful. A few art suggestions. These are good suggestions.
Be creative.
Now, is that something small group ministry can kind of foster with a group
Yes.
to kind of share the practices that become the strategies for self-soothing?
Yes. And the neat thing about that is young people can do it together. So suppose there's 2 runners in the group, or rollerbladers, or singers, or musicians, or, it's like, hey, let's go out and play the guitar and piano or drums together.
I think you've given someone an idea.
Yeah.
Petting a dog or cat.
Yes, that was my kitty Raspo who joined us earlier.
Okay, I have 2 choices of things to throw in here, and I'm going to go with the one that's not an anecdote. Someone has a question: what might a youth do who is in a controlling home and does not have free movement?
Yeah, and someone mentioned earlier that NSI is a way to have some control in their life. And there are young people who will engage in the behavior as a way to be in control. At least they have control of their body and what they do to it. That's again, you can work with them on other ways that they can gain control besides harming themselves. What are some of the other things that they can do to regulate their mood and to feel in control besides harming themselves?
Okay.
And help them problem solve and help them look at what their options are.
Someone's mentioned expressive therapies as back with the controlling home. Or do you have some suggestions for self-soothing in a situation that's restrictive like that?
Yeah, again, working with the young person to see what their options are. Are they able to join after-school programs? Are they able to join a community group? Are they, what are their options in terms of being outside of the controlling home? And again, what are some of the options they have to help themselves feel in control besides engaging in self-harm? Do they play an instrument? Are they athletic? Are they creative? Can they draw?
We have someone on the line who has a child who has done some of these behaviors and is reporting that it was extremely hard to find a counselor who would see the child, and that after seeing the counselor for a while, the child stopped going. And put this in the right phrase. I'm sorry, we had so many suggestions. Okay. Sorry, there are so many great ideas for self-soothing that I lost some of this anecdote. I guess you could speak to that about finding counseling if that's sometimes an issue.
Yeah, and it depends on where you are in the country. If you're in a large city, it may be easier. Smaller towns, a lot more difficult. And I am so sorry that your child is experiencing this. And, my heart goes out to you as the parent. I can only imagine that you felt, helpless, to help your child. So it may be challenging. Someone mentioned the website Right Love on Her Arms. Your best option may be to contact one of the national organizations, and possibly they can give you references that are close to your location. If you can't find a counselor who is proficient in dealing with non-suicidal self-injury, I would recommend trying to find a counselor who is familiar with addiction, or is familiar with working with someone with an eating disorder, or is familiar working with people with anxiety or depression as a specialty. But again, contacting one of the national organizations as you do research, because I'll admit this is not an all-encompassing presentation that you will have some work to do on your own in terms of locating organizations in your area. And based on that, if there's organizations in your area, then you can contact them and try to get references for counselors and support groups that are local to you.
A couple comments on that. Actually, I want to point out it's about 10 o'clock, so we need to decide if we're going to stay on and have some more conversation, and some people have said they need to go. So, but before that, let me throw these comments in, and then we'll decide what to do next. One person says, To Write Love on Her Arms does have resources for counselors who work with these issues. So,
Okay.
affirming what you just said. And this is from the parent. Just a note that the state of Washington, kids have medical privacy at age 13, which creates a little more trouble for parents responsible to ensure that the care is happening. Counselor can't speak to the parent. Yeah. So, Rev Monica, what would you like to do? If people want to speak some more, do we want to extend a little longer, or do we want to wrap up?
Well, for people who need to go, thank you for attending the webinar. And for folks who want to stay on and chat a little longer, I'm willing to go another 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Some people have said thank you and goodbye. You're welcome.
You are welcome.
Are there some more questions or some comments from people who would like to keep going? I think people might actually be done because we're getting a lot of thank yous and not a lot of chit chat.
Okay, and it is late.
It is. It's here. It's late in Boston.
Okay. Well, great.
Thank you, everybody.
I wish everyone sweet dreams.